So let's say that you're a newer player to 5th edition Dungeons & Dragons. You're all set to create your first character. You know how you're going to generate your ability scores, you know how you're going to pick out your equipment. But the next big question is, what kind of character are you going to create? Are you going to create a tough frontline fighter? Maybe a cunning spellcaster with the right spell for the right situation? And how is your character really going to fit into the dynamics of the team while you're at the table? A lot of times, because there are so many possibilities in D&D, it can be hard to narrow down your options into a few concrete choices. When developing a team dynamic, one of the most helpful things my table has found is figuring out what each character's role is going to be. And since most of the class features of the game revolve around combat, a lot of times it's a great place to start. Hi, I'm John, and welcome back to D&D Cram School. And today we're diving into the 4 rules of combat in 5th edition D&D. Now, just to get started with an understanding of what we're talking about when we're talking about combat roles, each character in a D&D party is going to fulfill one of these 4 roles we're going to talk about. If you've ever played a video game RPG or an MMO, you'll know that when you're creating a team of characters, that the individual characters will have their own specialties. In a video game, you might have a character that's the healer or a character that does control effects. And you might have just like one tough fighter that does a lot of damage. One thing I want to get out of the way before we dive too deep into what these roles are is that unlike video games, a lot of times in a tabletop RPG, these 4 rules of combat aren't static. You don't build a character to just be a damage dealer or just be a tank. Rather, I find that these roles are best used to distinguish between certain mindsets and priorities to match the shifting circumstances that can arise during combat. For example, I've seen a lot of players get stuck, say, playing a cleric, where they think of their character as the healer, but when there's no one that needs healing, what does the cleric do? So sometimes it's appropriate even for a healing character to have some kind of damage dealing cantrip or spell so that they can contribute in the most appropriate way if the party doesn't need a whole lot of support. Or it might be that you've already set up the support and your concentration is being used, so there's not really much else to do but to contribute through damage dealing. One of my favorite examples that I like to bring up with this is looking at 2 first level spells right in the player's handbook: Cure Wounds and Inflict Wounds. Cure Wounds will always hit because you're trying to heal someone. It has a range of touch, it costs a first level spell slot, and it heals 1d8 plus spellcasting modifier hit points. Let's just say for the sake of argument, we're using like an average point by character. It probably means that you're using a first level spell slot to let a creature regain 1d8 plus 3 hit points. Meaning that the range of healing is between 4 and 12 depending on what you get on the die roll. Inflict Wounds has the same range. It's touch, it costs a first level spell slot. There is a little bit more randomization in that you do have to hit your target, but on a hit, it deals 3d10 necrotic damage, meaning that the range is going to be between 3 and 30 hit points worth of damage. 4 to 12, 3 to 30. You can see that it's a lot easier to damage someone in D&D than it is to heal them. So because of that, we're looking for ways for either our creatures to avoid taking damage or to be better at their jobs so that combat can end quicker, so again, the enemy doesn't have a chance to hit us. So now diving right into it, let's talk about what the 4 rules are. The 4 rules of combat are DPR, tank, support, and control. Now this is the shorthand that my play group uses to identify these rules. These roles were even codified in 4th edition, and that kind of rubbed people the wrong way. Again, because I think that when you create characters that are meant to fulfill a static role, when that role becomes inappropriate, it feels like your character can't meaningfully contribute. So let's dive into what the characteristics of each of these roles are. We'll start off with kind of the easiest one, which is DPR, which stands for damage per round. And it comes from MMOs like World of Warcraft, where you had certain characters that would have a DPS, or a damage per second. But because tabletop RPGs are played in rounds instead of real time, DPR. Now, a lot of optimization guides will talk about DPR in terms of evaluating different builds. And really, most characters have some kind of damage dealing option. but that doesn't mean that they should fulfill the quote-unquote DPR role. When my table especially talks about fulfilling a DPR character build, what we're talking about is picking features and spells that are going to help us maximize the amount of damage that we're dealing each round. This could be direct to how many dice you're rolling when you hit a creature. So for example, taking levels of Rogue or Paladin, those classes have features that allow you to roll more dice when you hit, so theoretically you're dealing more damage. But it is more than just that. So for example, a DPR choice might be picking ways that you can increase your attack bonus so you're going to hit more often. After all, it's really hard to damage a creature if you can't hit it with an attack roll. Another thing to consider might be what kind of damage types you have available. Unfortunately, I've seen it a lot where, say, a player playing a spellcaster, they only pick like fire spells, but then they come up against an enemy that has resistance to fire damage. And there are a few ways you can move around that. One option would be to take the Elemental Adept feat, but another thing you might want to consider is having like a primary damage type and a secondary damage type. So say that you love using Fireball, but you're fighting a fire elemental. You instead have Shatter as a backup so that way it's not your best spell, but it's going to deal more damage than a creature that's immune to your fireball. Another great example of a DPR class would be Warlock, because their really signature ability, which is Eldritch Blast, deals not only a decent damage die, but also a really rarely resisted to damage type, which is Force. And if you look at the math at Eldritch Blast, especially between like 5th and 8th level, they're really hitting as hard as, say, like a fighter with a two-handed longsword. And there might be edge cases, especially if that fighter can pick up, say, a magic item, where that fighter is going to start dealing more damage. But still, I found that Eldritch Blast, especially dealing force damage, can be really versatile in dealing with a wide range of foes that might be resistant to non-magical damage. So, to reiterate, if just dealing the sheer most amount of damage is something that you're interested in as a beginning player, the classes that I'd recommend would be Rogue, Warlock, and Paladin. And if you're gonna pick a fighter, you just have to be a little bit careful about which subclasses you're gonna pick. Next up are tanks. Now, when my play group talks about tanks, really what we're talking about are characters that are survivable. This is one of those that's kind of a loaded term. So a lot of times when people think about tanking, they think about like an MMO like World of Warcraft, where tanks usually have abilities to taunt or provoke the enemy AI into targeting them. Now, because the enemies are controlled by a human, and that a lot of times story plays as much into combat decision making as, say, an optimal action economy in tabletop RPGs, we have to broaden our definition a little bit. Now, typically when we're talking about tanking characters in D&D, we're talking about characters that can max out their armor class, that have a high hit point pool, and can somehow reduce the amount of damage they're taking in. Bear Totem Barbarian is an excellent example of this. Not only do they have a alright armor class and a really sizable hit point pool, Bear Totem in particular allows your character to have resistance to all incoming damage besides psychic. So not only do they have the highest hit point pool in the game, they're having all of the damage incoming toward them, which essentially, functionally in a way, allows them to double the already massive amount of hit points that they have. Now, I'm not saying bear totems are invincible. There are definitely ways to counter them if you want to challenge them as a DM. But when it comes to survivability and making sure that you have an ally still up, they are one of the strongest options that you can pick. Now, the other thing to remember is that if you're going to play a tough tanking character, the objective is that you do want to be targeted and aimed at by enemy creatures, because your goal is to have your main DPR characters avoid taking damage so that they stay up to continue dealing the most amount of damage that they can. Just remember that when you're fulfilling the tanking role, you want your character to get hit, which is why I hesitate to call a lot of classes like clerics tanks, because a lot of times clerics, even though they might have a high armor class, they're probably also concentrating on a spell, and they have a very specific job to do in terms of keeping the other party members healthy. So if they're being targeted by attacks and, gosh forbid they go down, they're unable to fulfill a more meaningful role that's best left to other classes like barbarians and paladins. So like I just said, if you're a newer player and you're interested in being a tank character, my recommendations would be to build barbarians and paladins, possibly fighters based on the campaign that you're in. Next up, we're going to be talking about support, which in my opinion is one of the toughest roles to fulfill well. Now, a lot of people that come from, say, a video game RPG background might assume that looking at D&D's classes that healer is a role in and of itself. And I really strongly discourage this mindset, mostly because healing in D&D is relatively inefficient. The reason a lot of times healers are their own role in video games is because the amount of healing is equal to the amount of damage your party can take. I mean, heck, I was just playing Final Fantasy the other day, and a boss could one-shot one of my allies. But then my healing character could fully revive them back up to full HP, and they could do that multiple times. And of course, it's not that simple of an economy, but compared to something like D&D, healing is relatively efficient in video games. So that's why I like having healing be under the umbrella of support as an overall role. And really, support means healing your allies, but also making them better at their jobs. For example, support might be a bard's bardic inspiration feature, which allows a target to add a special die to attack rolls, saving throws, and ability checks. And especially if you've got, say, like a DPR character, like a paladin or a rogue, that really can make the most out of their hits, getting to add a D6 or a D8 to those attack rolls can mean the difference between a hit or a miss, can mean the difference between major damage and no damage, and can mean the difference between a fight that's resolved and a fight that keeps going and an enemy able to maybe kill one of your allied characters. A rogue with a strong attack bonus and advantage is still not as good as a rogue with a strong attack bonus, advantage, and a D6 that they can add to it. Now, if you're a beginner player and you want to experiment a little bit with support, my recommendation for classes would be Bard, Cleric, and Druid. The last role that we have to discuss is Control. The two main characteristics of fulfilling the Control role are somehow hampering your opponent's abilities to do what they do best and deal with large crowds. And these might even overlap. So for example, if you have a wizard with a fireball spell that can hit a large area, that might deal with a crowd very efficiently. And let's say that the enemy creatures that your DM is portraying are intelligent and tactical. They might now avoid certain positions so that they don't get fireballed again. That might hamper their positioning and make them less effective in combat. And in a way, just how support is about making your allies better at their jobs, there are just as many spells in the game that make enemies worse at their jobs. Control spells include things like Bane, Sleep, and Entangle. And the cool part is that there can be a lot of overlap between Control and support. So for example, let's take Entangle for instance. What that spell does is it makes a certain area difficult terrain, and it might restrain creatures that are in the area of effect of the spell. Those restrained creatures will have attack rolls against them have advantage, which means you're supporting your allies by allowing them to hit their targets more often, while at the same time hampering an enemy from operating as well as they could. Control characters can be very fun to play because you have to make a lot of turn-by-turn decision making to best hamper your enemy and best support your allies. But support and control can be overwhelming roles to play because a lot of times there are a lot of good options and you're trying to prioritize the best of a lot of good things, or the least worst of a lot of bad things. Characters that I find that make fantastic control characters include druids and wizards, although there are some other classes that have some good control options as well. Now that we've gotten the 4 roles identified, we actually get to reveal our hidden 5th role of combat. And to me, this role would be the pivot character. Pivot characters aren't going to stand out in, say, their damage output or their healing, but what they can do is adjust to the options that they make given what the situation is. A really good example of a character class like this would be Ranger. Rangers aren't really good damage dealers, but they do have access to the healing spirit spell, which is amazing when you need it. And there are no slouches in the damage department. They just might not hit as hard as, say, a paladin or a rogue as consistently. So rather, pivot characters are like second best at a few different things, and as the situation calls for it, they can step into a role in case there's an emergency. Usually, when I see a party struggle at the table, it's because there's a gap in one of these 4 roles, and a character isn't fulfilling a role as efficiently as they could be. For example, I played in games where say 3 out of the 4 party members are tank characters, and the last character is a ranged damage dealer. There are certain combat encounters that are completely trivial to that party, but then there are certain other combat encounters, say against a spellcaster that can do like a sleep spell or a hypnotic pattern, where the party then gets wiped. That's why I think it's good to identify what the 4 roles are, build characters to a primary role, but also keep in mind a secondary role that they can pivot into. And it's not a bad idea to have a character based on pivoting. So, for example, let's say you're playing a paladin character and they're really good at melee damage dealing and tanking, but then let's say they're a little bit out of position. Are there options that they can take where now maybe they have a better ranged option? It's not going to be their best option, but it's better than just standing there taking the dodge action. So, what are your thoughts on the 4 rules of combat? Have you found any success with any particular team combat dynamics? Is there one of these rules that you prefer to play or find more fulfilling than the others? Let me know in the comments down below. And remember to like and subscribe for more easy tips to get you started on your adventuring career. Have an awesome day, everybody. Bye-bye now.